The sterile calm of St. Mary's Hospital shattered the moment Gabriel Russo stormed through the automatic doors. Rain dripped from his black coat onto the pristine linoleum while nurses and security guards froze in the presence of a man who rolled the city's shadows. He had not come for money or revenge, but for the broken woman lying on the gurney. Sophia lay battered and unrecognizable in a blood-stained evening gown while her husband stood nearby in a flawless suit. Broadly, Hartwell smiled with practiced ease and lied to the doctors about a fall down the stairs. But Gabriel stopped listening the moment he knelt before the terrified 8-year-old girl curling in the chair beside her mother. He gently lifted Emma's chin, and the air left the room when he saw the dark purple bruises shaped like 5 fingers stamped across her small throat. Gabriel didn't breathe. He didn't blink. The image of those bruises burned into his retinas, searing away 10 years of restraint in a single heartbeat. The fragile trembling of the child under his fingertips was the only thing stopping him from drawing his weapon and ending a life right there on the sanitized floor. Slowly, deliberately, he released Emma's chin and rose to his full height. The transition was terrifying. He went from a gentle giant to a towering executioner in the span of a second. He turned his back on the child, shielding her from what was about to happen, and fixed his gaze solely on the man in the flawless suit. The background noise, the beeping monitors, the squeak of shoes ceased to exist. There was only the target. Broadly, Hartwell stood with the arrogance of someone who had never faced a consequence he couldn't buy his way out of, checking his expensive watch as if his wife's trauma was merely an inconvenience to his schedule. But the look in Gabriel's eyes made the blood drain from his face. "Security. Get him out," Broadly stammered, pointing a manicured finger that shook slightly as he looked around for support that wasn't coming. "This is a private family matter. You have no right." The hospital security guards shifted their weight uneasily, hands hovering near their belts, but not a single one of them moved forward because they knew exactly who Gabriel Russo was. They knew that the 3 men standing silently behind him, Marco, Leo, and Dante, were not bodyguards, but executioners who are waiting for a single signal to turn the emergency room into a war zone. Gabriel stepped closer until he was breathing the same air as the lawyer, smelling the expensive cologne that failed to mask the scent of stale scotch and fear. He looked at Bradley's hands, manicured and soft, and imagined them wrapping around the small neck of the girl sitting behind him. It took every ounce of discipline Gabriel possessed not to snap the man's wrists right there in front of the witnesses, but he knew that death was too easy a punishment for a monster who hid behind a suit. "An accident," Gabriel repeated the word, his voice a low rumble that vibrated through the floorboards. "You say she fell down the stairs, and the girl fell with her." Broadly straightened his tie, regaining a shred of his composure as he clung to the lie that had protected him for years. "That is correct," Broadly insisted, forcing a smile that looked more like a grimace. "My wife is clumsy, and the child is prone to theatrics. It was a chaotic evening, and we just want to go home to rest." Gabriel didn't blink. He simply tilted his head toward the doctor standing paralyzed by the gurney. "Doctor," Gabriel said without looking away from Broadly, "tell me, in your professional opinion, do stairs leave fingerprints on a child's trachea?" The doctor, a young resident who looked like he wanted to be anywhere else in the world, swallowed hard and looked down at his clipboard, his hands shaking. The silence stretched again, agonizing and thick, until the doctor whispered, "No. No, they do not." Broadly's face flushed a deep, angry crimson as his narrative began to crack under the weight of the truth. "This is outrageous," he shouted, stepping forward to assert his dominance, a tactic that worked in courtrooms but meant nothing in the face of a man who lived by the gun. "I am Broadly Hartwell, senior partner at Morrison and Associates. I will have your badges, your licenses, and your jobs if you do not get this thug out of my face." Gabriel moved faster than anyone expected. One hand shot out and gripped Broadly's throat, slamming him back against the hard plastic of a vending machine. The glass rattled, and a collective gasp swept through the onlookers, but no one intervened. Gabriel leaned in close, his voice dropping to a whisper that only Bradley could hear, intimate and terrifying. "And I am Gabriel Russo. I don't care about your partners or your licenses. If you say one more word, I will cut out your tongue and feed it to you." He released Bradley with a shove that sent the lawyer stumbling to the floor, gasping for air and clutching his chest. Gabriel turned his back on the pathetic figure and walked over to the gurney where Sophia lay half-conscious. Her face was swollen, one eye completely shut, and her arm was splinted in a temporary cast, but when she opened her good eye and saw him, a flicker of recognition cut through the haze of pain. She tried to speak, her lips cracked and dry, but Gabriel shushed her gently, brushing a strand of matted hair away from her forehead with a tenderness that shocked the watching nurses. "I've got you," he murmured, his thumb grazing a bruise on her cheekbone. "I'm taking you out of here." He nodded to Marco and Leo, who immediately unlocked the brakes on the gurney and began to wheel it toward the exit. The movement snapped the hospital staff out of their trance, and a senior nurse stepped forward, holding up a hand. "You can't just take a patient," she protested weakly. "She hasn't been discharged. There is paperwork. The police need to take a statement." Gabriel stopped and looked at the nurse, his expression softening just enough to show he held no ill will toward her. "The police work for him," Gabriel said, gesturing to Bradley, who was scrambling to his feet. "If she stays here, she dies tonight. Is that what you want on your conscience?" The nurse looked at Bradley, then back at the battered woman, and slowly lowered her hand, stepping aside to clear the path. Gabriel turned his attention to the chair where Emma was still curled in a tight ball, clutching a worn stuffed rabbit as if it were a shield. She watched him with wide, terrified eyes, shrinking back as he approached. Gabriel crouched down, ignoring the ache in his knees, lowering himself until he was smaller than her. He didn't reach out. He didn't try to touch her. He just waited, letting her see that his hands were open and empty. "Emma," he said softly, using the name he had learned from the frantic phone call 20 minutes ago. "My name is Gabriel. I am a friend of your mother. I'm going to take her to a safe place where no one can hurt her again." The little girl looked at her mother on the moving gurney, then back at the large man in the wet coat. She looked at Bradley, who was now shouting into a cell phone, his face twisted in a mask of hate. "I'm not going to leave you here," Gabriel promised, extending a hand palm up. "But I need you to be brave. Can you be brave for your mom?" Emma hesitated for a heartbeat, her gaze darting between the monster she knew and the stranger offering salvation. Then, with a small, trembling breath, she slid off the chair and placed her tiny, cold hand in his. Gabriel lifted her effortlessly into his arms, settling her against his chest where his heart beat steady and strong. He pushed through the automatic doors into the pouring rain, ignoring the lawyer screaming behind him, knowing that for the first time in 10 years, he was doing the right thing. The elevator doors slid open with a soft chime that sounded like a gunshot in the heavy silence, revealing the sprawling expanse of Gabriel's penthouse. This was his fortress, a sanctuary of glass and steel perched high above the city's weeping skyline, designed to keep threats out, but tonight it felt more like a triage unit for the casualties of a war he hadn't known he was fighting. He carried Emma into the living room while Marco and Leo carefully maneuvered the gurney they had commandeered from the hospital into the master bedroom. The space was warm, lit by the amber glow of recessed lighting and smelling faintly of cedar and expensive leather, a stark contrast to the antiseptic sting of the emergency room. Yet, the luxury offered no comfort to the little girl in his arms who remained stiff as a board, her eyes darting toward every shadow as if expecting a monster to leap out from behind the velvet curtains. Gabriel sat her down on the oversized sofa, and she immediately scrambled to the corner, pulling her knees to her chest and gripping the stuffed rabbit so tightly that its seams threatened to burst. Dr. Eris was already waiting in the bedroom, his back open and his expression grin as he began to cut away the ruined fabric of Sophia's evening gown. Gabriel stood in the doorway, his hands clenched into fists at his sides, forcing himself to watch every second of the examination because he needed to burn the image of her pain into his memory. The doctor worked in silence, his efficient hands cataloging the damage that Hartwell had inflicted: a transverse fracture of the left ulna, 3 cracked ribs on the right side, and a severe concussion that kept drifting her in and out of consciousness. The bruising was a map of agony, blooming in dark violets and sickly yellows across her pale skin, marking the places where a husband's hands and feet had struck the woman he had vowed to cherish. Every gasp of pain that escaped Sophia's lips as the doctor set the bone felt like a knife twisting in Gabriel's gut, a physical manifestation of the guilt that had been eating him alive since the phone call. When the doctor finally stepped back to prepare a sedative, Gabriel moved to the bedside, his shadow falling over the woman he had loved for a decade. Sophia blinked her eyes open, the drugs making her gaze unfocused and glassy, but she seemed to sense a presence looming over her. Gabriel reached out slowly, his intention only to brush a stray lock of hair from her sweat-dampened forehead, a gesture of tenderness he had dreamed of for years. But the moment his hand broke the plane of her vision, Sophia's body convulsed with a violent, instinctive jerk. She threw her uninjured arm up to shield her face, curling into a fetal position with a whimpered plea that wasn't a word but a raw sound of terror. The reaction was faster than thought, a conditioned reflex drilled into her by years of anticipating a blow, and it froze Gabriel in place as if he had been struck by lightning. He pulled his hand back as though burned, his chest heaving with a sudden, suffocating rage directed entirely at himself. He had left her 10 years ago to protect her, believing that his world of guns and crime was too dangerous for a woman made of light. He had pushed her toward Hartwell because the man was a lawyer, a pillar of society, someone who lived in the daylight where safety was supposed to be guaranteed. But as he looked at Sophia cowering from his touch, Gabriel realized with nauseating clarity that the monsters weren't just in the shadows. He had handed her to a devil wrapped in a silk tie, abandoning her to a torture chamber that masqueraded as a suburban mansion. The safe life he had sacrificed his own happiness to give her had been a lie, a gilded cage where she had been slowly dismantled piece by piece while he sat in his tower thinking he had done the noble thing. A small movement at the door drew his attention, and he turned to see Emma standing there, her small frame trembling, but her chin set with a defiance that mirrored his own. She marched past him to the bed, climbing up despite the height of the mattress, and curled her body around her mother's uninjured side. She glared at Gabriel, a silent warning that she would bite him, scratch him, or fight him to the death if he tried to hurt them. Teresa, the elderly housekeeper who had served Gabriel for 15 years, entered quietly with a tray of warm soup and soft bread. She approached the bed with a grandmotherly smile, offering the spoon to the child, but Emma shook her head violently, pressing her face into Sophia's shoulder. She wouldn't eat. She wouldn't sleep. She wouldn't let her guard down for a single second because in her world, sleep was when the bad things happened. "She won't eat, sir," Teresa whispered, her eyes filling with tears as she looked at the bruised child. "She's waiting for permission." The words hit Gabriel like a physical blow. Waiting for permission to eat. Waiting for permission to breathe. He walked to the window and stared out at the rain-lashed city, the lights blurring into streaks of gold and red. He had built an empire on fear, commanded armies of men, and silenced enemies with a look, yet he had failed to protect the only 2 people who mattered. The realization settled over him, heavy and permanent, shifting something fundamental in his soul. The time for noble sacrifices was over. He turned back to the room, watching the broken woman and the warrior child, and swore a silent oath to the darkness outside. No one would ever touch them again. Not the law, not the husband, not God himself. If he had to burn the city to ash to keep them warm, he would strike the match without hesitation. The digital clock on the bedside table flickered to 3 a.m., casting a faint green glow over the room that smelled of antiseptic and rain. Emma had finally succumbed to exhaustion, curled up at the foot of the massive bed like a small, wounded animal refusing to leave its den, while Gabriel sat in a leather armchair he had pulled close to the mattress. He watched the rise and fall of Sophia's chest, terrified that if he looked away, she might stop breathing altogether. The sedatives Dr. Eris administered had taken the edge off her physical agony, but her eyes were open, staring at the ceiling with a hollow emptiness that frightened him more than the bruises. He wanted to reach out and take her hand, to bridge the 10-year chasm between them with a touch, but the memory of her flinching earlier paralyzed him. He was the most powerful crime lord in the city, a man who moved armies and toppled rivals, yet sitting here in the quiet dark, he felt completely helpless against the ghosts of a decade he couldn't rewrite. "Why didn't you call me?" Gabriel asked, his voice rough with the smoke of unshed tears and suppressed rage. It wasn't an accusation, but a plea for understanding, a desperate need to know how the vibrant, fearless girl he had loved became this broken shell. Sophia turned her head slowly on the pillow, the movement causing a grimace of pain to ripple across her battered features. She looked at him, really looked at him for the first time that night, and her cracked lips twisted into a smile that lacked any joy. "Call you," she whispered, her voice sounding like dry leaves scraping together. "With what phone?" "He smashed the first one 3 years ago when I tried to call a shelter. The second one he monitored with software that tracked every keystroke. And even if I could have called, what would I have said? That I made a mistake? That the safe, respectable life you wanted for me was a prison?" Gabriel flinched as if she had struck him. The truth of her words hung heavy in the air, suffocating him with the weight of his own good intentions. Sophia closed her eyes, tears leaking from the corners to track through the blood dried on her cheek, as she continued to peel back the layers of her nightmare. "It wasn't the hitting at first," she murmured, drifting in the haze of the medication. "It was the silence. He fired the housekeeper so I would have to do everything. He told my friends I was depressed and didn't want to see them until they stopped calling. He canceled my credit cards because he said I was irresponsible with money. Piece by piece, he erased me, Gabriel. He told me that because I was an orphan, no one else would ever want me. He said I was damaged goods and that I should be grateful a man of his stature was willing to keep a stray dog in his house." The confession ignited a fire in Gabriel's chest, a cold, dark burn that demanded retribution. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, and clasped his hands together until the knuckles turned white. "I thought I was saving you," he admitted, his voice dropping to a low rumble that vibrated through the quiet room. 10 years ago, when I walked away, I told myself I was the monster. I told myself that my world was too dark, too violent, and that you deserved a man who walked in the sunlight. I thought I was being noble by breaking my own heart to give you a chance at a normal life." He looked at her, his dark eyes filled with the torture that matched hers. "But I was a coward. I was so afraid of my enemies hurting you that I handed you directly to the devil. I didn't save you, Sophia. I abandoned you." Sophia opened her eyes again, the drug-induced fog clearing just enough for her to see the man beneath the monster's reputation. She saw the guilt eating him alive, the same guilt she had carried for staying, for failing to protect Emma, for believing Bradley's lies about her own worthlessness. She slowly slid her hand across the silk sheets, her fingers trembling as they reached for him. This time, she didn't flinch. She laid her bruised palm over his clenched fist, her skin cool against his feverish heat. "We were both wrong," she whispered, her voice gaining a fraction of strength. "We both believed that love wasn't enough to survive. But you're here now. You came for us when no one else would." Gabriel turned his hand over, interlacing his fingers with hers, careful not to squeeze too hard, careful to be the gentle anchor she needed. The connection sent a shockwave through him, a renewal of the vow he had made in the rain outside the hospital. He brought her hand to his lips, kissing the knuckles that were scraped raw from her fall down the stairs. "I am here," he vowed, his eyes locking onto hers with a fierce intensity. "And I am not going anywhere. I don't care about the law. I don't care about his reputation. From this moment on, you are under my protection. And if Broadley Hartwell thinks he can use the courts to get you back, he is going to learn that a piece of paper cannot stop a storm." As Sophia drifted back into sleep, holding onto his hand like a lifeline, Gabriel knew the peace was temporary. The war was coming, not with guns and soldiers, but with writs and subpoenas, and he was ready to burn the entire legal system to the ground to keep his promise. The morning sun that flooded the penthouse floor-to-ceiling windows offered no warmth, serving only to illuminate the nightmare unfolding on the 60-inch television screen. Gabriel stood motionless in the center of the living room, a mug of black coffee forgotten in his hand, watching as Broadley Hartwell gave the performance of a lifetime to a gaggle of sympathetic reporters. The lawyer stood on the steps of the Hartwell estate, looking disheveled and sleepless, a masterclass in calculated vulnerability as he wiped a non-existent tear from his eye. "My wife, Sophia, has struggled with severe mental health issues for years," Bradley choked out, his voice trembling with practiced sorrow. "She is fragile, confused, and prone to hallucinations. And now, a known criminal, a violent predator named Gabriel Russo, has taken advantage of her condition to abduct her and my daughter." He looked directly into the camera lens, his eyes pleading. "Sophia, if you can hear me, please, just come home. We love you. We forgive you." Sophia sat on the edge of the sofa, wrapped in a cashmere blanket, shaking so violently that her teeth chattered in the silent room. "He's winning," she whispered, her voice hollow with despair. "He's twisting everything. Everyone believes him because he's the grieving husband and you're the Mafia boss." Gabriel muted the television with a sharp jab of his thumb, cutting off Bradley's lies, but the damage hung in the air like toxic smoke. He turned to face her, seeing the terror that had returned to her eyes, erasing the fragile peace they had built in the darkness of the night before. "He isn't winning, Sophia," Gabriel said, though he felt the walls closing in. "He is desperate. This is the move of a man who knows he has lost control and is trying to burn down the board." But even as he spoke the words, the wail of sirens rose from the streets below, a rising chorus that announced the arrival of the city's uniformed enforcers. Marco burst into the room a second later, his face grim and his hand resting instinctively on the gun beneath his jacket. "Boss, we've got a problem," he reported, his voice tight. "It's not just a patrol car. It's half the precinct. SWAT is setting up a perimeter, and there is a hostage negotiator on the bullhorn downstairs. They have a warrant for your arrest, Gabriel. Kidnapping and custodial interference." Gabriel cursed under his breath, a sharp Italian profanity that made Emma look up from her coloring book. He walked to the window and looked down. The street was a sea of flashing blue and red lights, a blockade designed not just to arrest him, but to humiliate him. Broadley hadn't just called the cops. He had orchestrated a spectacle to force Gabriel's hand, hoping the violent criminal would open fire and justify a lethal response. "Stay here," Gabriel ordered, turning to Sophia and Emma. "Do not go near the windows. Do not answer the phone. Marco, Dante, keep them safe. If anyone comes through that elevator who isn't me, put them down." He didn't wait for an acknowledgement, spinning on his heel and striding toward the private elevator. He couldn't fight this battle with bullets. If he fired a single shot, he proved Bradley right. If he hurt a cop, Sophia would be dragged back to her husband as a rescued victim, and he would be dead or in prison. This was a siege of paperwork and perception, and he had to fight it with the only weapon Bradley thought he didn't possess: restraint. The lobby of the Russo Tower was a tense standoff of marble and Kevlar. 6 SWAT officers stood with rifles raised, aiming at the elevator doors as they slid open, while the building's private security team held the line with hands hovering near their holsters. Gabriel stepped out alone, unarmed, wearing a tailored 3-piece suit that cost more than the lead detective made in a year. He raised his hands slowly, palms open, not in surrender, but in a gesture of mocking calm. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice projecting clearly across the echoing lobby. "Is there a reason you are terrifying my tenants at 9 in the morning?" A man in a trench coat stepped forward, holding a piece of paper like a shield. Detective Miller, a man Gabriel knew was ambitious, but not necessarily corrupt, scowled. "Gabriel Russo, I have a warrant for your arrest for the kidnapping of Sophia and Emma Hartwell. Step forward and place your hands behind your back." Gabriel didn't move. He stood his ground, radiating an aura of power that made the officers hesitate. "There is no kidnapping, detective," he stated flatly. "Mrs. Hartwell is upstairs by her own choice, recovering from injuries inflicted by the man who signed that complaint. If you want to speak to her, you can do so through her attorney, who is filing a restraining order against Broadley Hartwell as we speak." Miller stepped closer, his jaw set. "I don't care about your stories, Russo. I have a court order signed by Judge Morrison. Either you hand them over, or we come up there and take them. And if we have to breach, it won't be polite. Judge Morrison." The name clicked in Gabriel's mind, a known associate of the Hartwell family, a man who frequented the same country clubs and high-stakes poker games. The corruption wasn't just a suspicion anymore, it was a wall standing between him and justice. Gabriel realized he had seconds to de-escalate before the tear gas started flying. He reached into his jacket pocket slowly, ignoring the way 12 rifles tracked the movement, and pulled out a sleek black phone. "You can breach," Gabriel said, his eyes locking with Miller's. "But before you do, you might want to talk to the mayor. I believe he's on the line right now, wondering why his police chief is authorizing a raid on one of the city's biggest real estate investors based on the word of a wife-beater." It was a bluff, partially. Gabriel didn't have the mayor on the line yet, but he had the mayor's dirty laundry in a safe deposit box, and everyone in the room knew it. He dialed a number, not the mayor, but Silas, the most ruthless defense attorney in the state. "Silas," Gabriel said into the receiver, keeping his eyes on the detective. "I have Detective Miller here threatening to storm my home without a warrant to interview the alleged victim. Get Judge Sterling on the phone and get an emergency stay. Tell him we have medical evidence of abuse, and we are filing for emergency protective custody." He held the phone out toward Miller. "Your choice, detective. You can wait 10 minutes for the stay, or you can breach, cause a scene, and explain to the press why you raided a domestic violence shelter." Miller glared, his finger twitching near the trigger guard, but the seed of doubt had been planted. He lowered his weapon slightly. "You have 10 minutes, Russo. If that stay doesn't come through, I'm kicking down your door." Gabriel nodded, turning back to the elevator with a cold smile, knowing he had bought time, but not victory. He needed ammo. He needed dirt. And he needed it now. The heavy steel doors of the elevator sealed Gabriel away from the chaos in the lobby, but the silence that greeted him in the penthouse was far more suffocating than the sirens outside. The stay order from Judge Sterling had come through with seconds to spare, forcing Detective Miller to retreat to the sidewalk, yet Gabriel knew it was a temporary dam holding back a flood that threatened to drown them all. He found Marco and Leo in his private office, a room usually reserved for managing shipping lanes and laundering revenue, now transformed into a war room illuminated by the blue glow of multiple monitors. Leo, a man whose skills with a keyboard were more lethal than a sniper rifle, was typing furiously, his eyes darting across streams of data that represented the hidden life of Bradley Hartwell. Gabriel walked to the desk and placed his hands on the mahogany surface, leaning in with the intensity of a predator watching for movement in the tall grass. "Tell me you have something," he demanded, his voice low and dangerous. "I bought us 24 hours at best. After that, Morrison will find another judge, or Miller will manufacture probable cause to kick down the door. I need ammunition, Leo. I need to know how a man beats his wife for 7 years and stays a saint in the public eye." Leo stopped typing and exhaled a cloud of vape smoke that smelled like artificial vanilla, turning one of the monitors so Gabriel could see the spreadsheet that looked like a ledger of pain. "I found the medical records," Leo said, his voice lacking its usual cynical edge, replaced by a quiet horror that unsettled Gabriel more than shouting would have. It wasn't easy. The hospital server was encrypted tighter than the Pentagon, but I got in through the billing department's back door. He pointed a trembling finger at the screen where a list of dates and diagnoses scrolled down, seemingly endless. 23 admissions in 7 years, boss. 23. Broken ribs, fractured wrists, orbital socket damage, severe concussions, lacerations requiring stitches. Every single one of them is listed as an accident. Fell down the stairs. Slipped in the shower. Walked into a door. Car accident. It reads like a comedy of errors, except the injuries are consistent with blunt force trauma from a fist or a boot. Gabriel scanned the list, his stomach twisting into a knot of cold fury as he realized that every entry represented a night where Sophia had lain bleeding, praying for help that never came. "Look at the attending physician," Gabriel ordered, pointing to the name that repeated in the signature block of every single report. Dr. Michael Stevens, chief of emergency medicine at 3 major hospitals and, according to social media, a regular golf partner of Broadley Hartwell at the Oaks Country Club. The picture began to form, ugly and sharp, a conspiracy of silence bought with membership fees and blood money. He didn't just turn a blind eye, Gabriel growled, the realization fueling the fire in his veins. He facilitated it. He patched her up, signed the lies, and sent her back to the butcher to be broken again. He sanitized the abuse so the police would never have a reason to investigate. But a doctor was only one leg of the stool. A man like Bradley needed more than medical cover to keep a woman trapped in a visible marriage for a decade without a single whisper reaching the courts. "Check the legal filings," Gabriel commanded, pacing the room as his mind raced through the implications of the blockade outside. Sophia said she tried to leave. She said she filed for divorce 4 years ago. Where is that paperwork? Why isn't there a record of a custody battle? Leo typed in a new query, accessing the county clerk's sealed archives, and a moment later, a suppressed file popped up on the center screen. "Here it is," Leo said, reading the legal jargon with a scowl. "Petition for dissolution of marriage, filed 2019. Dismissed with prejudice 3 days later." The judge ruled that the petitioner, Sophia, was mentally incompetent to make legal decisions due to severe emotional instability and granted Bradley full power of attorney over her affairs. Gabriel looked at the signature at the bottom of the dismissal order, the ink black and final. "Judge Richard Morrison," Gabriel read aloud, the name tasting like ash. "The same judge who signed the warrant for my arrest this morning. The same judge who has been on the Hartwell payroll for 20 years. The triangle of silence was completing itself in front of his eyes, a fortress built to keep Sophia in and the truth out. "What about the police?" Gabriel asked, turning to Marco, who had been cross-referencing emergency call logs. Sophia said the neighbors called 911. She said patrol cars came to the house. Marco nodded, tossing a stack of printed reports onto the desk. "They did come. 6 times. Domestic disturbance, calls logged by the dispatch center. But look at the disposition codes. Unfounded. Verbal dispute only. No report taken. Every single time, the responding officers were waved off before they even stepped inside." Marco tapped a name listed as the watch commander on every one of those nights. Captain Frank Davis. Now Police Chief Frank Davis. He buried the calls, Gabriel. He made sure that no matter how loud she screamed, it never made it onto the official record. Gabriel stared at the 3 names glowing on the screens: Dr. Stevens, Judge Morrison, Chief Davis. This wasn't just domestic abuse, it was a systemic eradication of a human being's rights, orchestrated by the very men sworn to protect them. Broadley Hartwell hadn't acted alone. He had rented the city's infrastructure to torment his wife. The rage that had been a chaotic storm in Gabriel's chest suddenly crystallized into a cold, diamond-hard resolve. He didn't just want to save Sophia anymore. He wanted to burn this entire corrupt ecosystem to the ground. "They think they are the law," Gabriel whispered, his voice terrifyingly calm. "They think their titles and their badges make them untouchable." He turned to his men, his eyes dark with the promise of violence. "Print everything. Every falsified report, every suppressed call, every dirty ruling. We are going to fight them in court, and we are going to shoot it out in the street. We are going to make them bleed the only way men like that know how to bleed. We are going to take their reputations, their careers, and their freedom." Just then, the intercom on the desk buzzed, interrupting the strategy session. "Mr. Russo," the concierge's voice crackled through the speaker, sounding nervous. "There is a woman in the service elevator. She bypassed security. She says she's a police officer, but she's not wearing a uniform. She says she is something you need to see. Her name is Amanda Cole." Gabriel exchanged a look with Marco, his hand drifting toward the gun in his shoulder holster. A cop sneaking in the back door while the SWAT team was at the front? It smelled like a trap, or perhaps it was the first crack in the enemy's armor. "Let her up," Gabriel ordered, buttoning his jacket. "But if she so much as twitches wrong, she doesn't leave." The elevator doors slid open moments later, revealing a woman in a trench coat with rain-soaked hair and eyes that held a decade of suppressed anger. She didn't look like an enemy. She looked like someone who had been waiting a very long time for a war to start. Amanda Cole stepped out of the elevator with the weary grace of a woman who had spent too many years pushing against a wall that refused to move. Her trench coat was soaked through, dripping rainwater onto the expensive hardwood floor, but she didn't seem to notice or care about the mess she was making in a Mafia boss's sanctuary. Gabriel watched her closely, his instincts as a predator assessing the threat level she posed, but all he saw in her eyes was a burning, cold exhaustion that matched his own. She didn't look like a cop who was here to serve a warrant. She looked like a soldier who had finally found an army to fight her war. Marco and Leo kept their hands hovering near their weapons, their bodies tense coils of potential violence, but Gabriel signaled them to stand down with a slight tilt of his head. "You're a long way from the precinct, Detective," Gabriel said, his voice neutral but carrying a weight that filled the room. "And considering your colleagues are currently trying to batter down my front door, you have exactly 2 minutes to tell me why I shouldn't throw you back down the shaft." Amanda didn't flinch at the threat, nor did she waste time with pleasantries. She walked straight to the heavy oak desk and dropped a weathered cardboard box onto the polished surface, the thud echoing like a gavel strike in the silent room. "My colleagues are idiots who take orders from a man who should be in prison," she stated, her voice raspy from years of chain smoking and shouting to be heard. "I'm not here for you, Russo. I'm here for the man you took from that hospital last night. I'm here for Bradley Hartwell." She opened the box, the smell of old paper and stale evidence drifting into the air, and began laying out file folders that had turned yellow with age. 10 years ago, I was the lead detective on the death of Catherine Hartwell, Bradley's first wife. The official report says she drowned in the bathtub after slipping and hitting her head. A tragic accident. A grieving widower. She pulled out a stack of glossy 8x10 photographs and spread them like a tarot deck of death across the desk. "But dead women tell tales if you know how to look," and Catherine was screaming. Gabriel looked down at the photographs, and his stomach turned over with a sick familiarity that made his hands clench into fists. The woman in the pictures was beautiful, blonde, and lifeless, lying on a metal autopsy table, but it was the marks on her skin that drew his eye. Dark, finger-shaped bruises on her arms. A split lip that had healed and reopened. Old fractures in her ribs that matched the ones Sophia was currently nursing in the other room. "I tried to classify it as a homicide," Amanda continued, her finger tracing the bruising around the victim's neck. The petechial hemorrhaging in her eyes indicated strangulation, not drowning. The water in her lungs was minimal, suggesting she was dead before she went under. "I had a case. I had a timeline. I had a witness who heard screaming that night. She looked up at Gabriel, her expression hardening into granite. And then Captain Davis, who is now your police chief, pulled me into his office. He told me the medical examiner had ruled it an accident. He told me the witness was unreliable. He told me if I didn't drop it, I would be walking a beat in the worst neighborhood in the city until I retired. The case was closed in 48 hours. Leo stepped forward, picking up a document that looked like a financial statement, his eyes widening as he scanned the numbers. Insurance, Leo muttered, looking at Gabriel. A $3 million life insurance policy, taken out 6 months before she died. Bradley was the sole beneficiary. He used the payout to buy his partnership at the law firm. The pieces of the puzzle clicked together with a terrifying precision, revealing a picture far darker than simple domestic abuse. Bradley Hartwell wasn't just a man with a temper. He was a predator who used marriage as a hunting ground, a black widow in a tailored suit who turned women into stepping stones for his ambition. He killed her for the money, Gabriel said, the realization settling in his chest like a stone. And he got away with it because he bought the police, the judge, and the doctor. And he was going to do it again, Amanda said, pulling one final document from the box. I pulled this from the archives this morning before I came here. It's a life insurance policy on Sophia Hartwell. $5 million. Double indemnity for accidental death. Gabriel stared at the paper, seeing his own name listed nowhere, seeing only the cold calculation of a man who had priced his wife's life at $5 million. The beatings, the isolation, the psychological torture, it wasn't just cruelty, it was preparation. Bradley had been breaking Sophia down, staging the accidents, creating a paper trail of clumsiness and mental instability so that when she finally fell down the stairs for the last time, no one would ask questions. Gabriel hadn't just saved Sophia from a hospital bed, he had pulled her out of a grave that had already been dug. Why bring this to me? Gabriel asked, looking at the disgraced detective who had risked her career and likely her freedom to deliver this fox. Why not go to the FBI? Why not the press? Amanda let out a short, bitter laugh that held no humor. The FBI needs probable cause, and the press needs a source who isn't a washed-up detective with a history of insubordination. I've sat on this evidence for 10 years, waiting for someone strong enough to use it. I can't touch him, Russo. The system is rigged to protect men like him. She leaned across the desk, her eyes locking with his. But you? You exist outside the system. You don't need a warrant to make a man bleed. I give you the gun and you pull the trigger. We take down Bradley, we take down Davis, we take down all of them. Gabriel looked at the files, then at the closed door of the bedroom where Sophia was sleeping, unaware of how close she had come to joining Catherine in the dark. He nodded slowly, a pact formed in blood and vengeance. Welcome to the team, Detective, Gabriel said. Now let's go hunting. The counteroffensive began not with a gunshot, but with the synchronized ticking of a watch as Gabriel stared out at the police blockade below. He had spent the last hour dismantling the lives of 3 powerful men on a whiteboard, turning their vices into weapons that would cut far deeper than any knife. Marco had left the penthouse 20 minutes ago via the service elevator, slipping past the perimeter with the stealth of a ghost, while Leo sat poised at his computer, his finger hovering over the enter key that would detonate a digital bomb. Amanda Cole stood by the window, smoking a cigarette she hadn't bothered to ask permission for, her eyes fixed on the command center she used to call home. They are going to realize too late that they picked a fight with the wrong wolf, Gabriel said, his voice devoid of mercy. Execute it. Leo pressed the key, and across the city, the invisible noose Gabriel had woven began to tighten around the necks of Bradley Hartwell's protectors. Dr. Michael Stevens was just finishing his front 9 at the Oaks Country Club, laughing at a joke made by his caddy, when he opened his locker to find Marco sitting on the bench, cleaning a fingernail with a serrated hunting knife. The locker room was empty, the air thick with the smell of steam and expensive aftershave, but suddenly it stank of fear. Stevens dropped his towel, his eyes darting to the door that Marco had already locked. "You have steady hands, Doctor," Marco said softly, standing up to tower over the trembling physician. "Ideally suited for stitching up battered women and signing false reports. It would be a tragedy if those hands were compromised." He stepped closer, the knife glinting under the fluorescent lights. "We have the original X-rays you tried to delete. We have the bank transfers from Hartwell. You have two choices. You can go to the FBI right now and confess to 23 counts of falsifying medical records, or I can make sure you never hold a scalpel again." Stevens didn't need to think. He felt his knees, weeping like a child, and promised to tell the feds everything, trading his career to save his fingers. Simultaneously, in the mahogany-paneled chambers of the city courthouse, Judge Richard Morrison's private phone buzzed with a message that made the blood drain from his face. It was a single PDF file containing a comprehensive list of his gambling debts to an offshore casino, totaling nearly $2 million, alongside photos of him accepting cash envelopes from Broadley Hartwell in a parking garage. The text beneath the images was brief and terrifying. "Rescind the warrant. Grant the protective order. Resign. Or this goes to the Ethics Committee and your wife." Morrison stared at the screen, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He had spent 20 years building a reputation as a pillar of law and order, and in 1 second, he saw it all crumbling into dust. With shaking hands, he picked up his office phone and dialed the police dispatch. "This is Judge Morrison," he croaked, his voice cracking. "There has been an error with the Russo warrant. Recall the units." I said recall them immediately. The final domino fell in the lobby of the Channel 5 news station, where Amanda Cole walked past the security desk and slapped a thick file onto the anchor's desk just minutes before the midday broadcast. "You on the story of the year?" she asked the stunned journalist. "Police Chief Davis has been burying domestic violence calls for a decade to protect his wealthy friends. Here are the dispatch logs, the suppressed reports, and the witness statements he ordered destroyed." She didn't wait for a thank you. She just walked out as the newsroom exploded into chaos, producers scrambling to verify the bombshell that would end Frank Davis's career before the sun went down. Within minutes, the breaking news alert flashed across every screen in the city. Corruption scandal rocks police department. Chief Davis accused of cover-up in Hartwell case. Back in the penthouse, Gabriel watched the scene on the street transform. The SWAT team lowered their weapons, confusion rippling through the ranks as the order to stand down came over their radios. The flashing lights that had besieged the tower for hours flickered off one by one, and the patrol cars began to peel away, leaving the pavement wet and empty. The siege was broken. The triangle of silence that had protected Bradley Hartwell for 10 years had been shattered in less than an hour, not by bullets, but by the weight of its own corruption. Gabriel turned away from the window and walked to the bedroom where Sophia was sitting up, watching the news report with wide, unbelieving eyes. "They're gone," Gabriel said gently, sitting beside her. "The doctor, the judge, the chief. They can't hurt you anymore." Sophia looked at him, and then at the screen where Bradley's face was now being shown not as a grieving husband, but as a suspect in a widening scandal. For the first time in years, the monster looked small. The silence that settled over the penthouse following the dismantling of the blockade was not peaceful, but heavy with the static charge of a storm that hadn't quite finished breaking. Gabriel stood by the window, watching the last of the news vans retreat from the street below, while Sophia sat at the dining table, her good hand resting on the thick file folder labeled Catherine Hartwell. She had spent the last hour reading every page, absorbing the autopsy photos and the insurance policies, letting the horror of what her husband had done to another woman metabolize into a cold, hard knot in her stomach. The realization that her 7 years of suffering were not a marriage but a slow-motion murder plot had stripped away the last layers of her denial, leaving her exposed but strangely steady. When the secure landline on Gabriel's desk began to trill, cutting through the quiet like a razor. Everyone in the room froze. Gabriel picked it up, his face hardening as he listened to the voice on the other end, and for a moment, he looked ready to crush the device in his hand. Instead, he covered the mouthpiece and looked at Sophia with a question in his dark eyes. "It's him," Gabriel said, his voice low. "You don't have to talk to him. I can hang up right now." Sophia stared at the phone, her heart hammering against her bruised ribs in a rhythm of panic that her body had memorized over a decade. Her instinct was to run, to hide in the bedroom with Emma and cover her ears, to let Gabriel be the shield that kept the monster at bay. But then she looked at the file on the table, at the face of the dead woman who had never gotten the chance to fight back, and something inside her shifted. If she didn't face him now, if she let him remain a voice that commanded fear from the shadows, she would never truly leave that house. She stood up, her legs trembling but holding her weight, and walked across the room. "Give it to me," she whispered, taking the receiver from Gabriel's hand before she could change her mind. She pressed the plastic against her ear, bracing herself for the shouting, for the threats, for the rage she knew so well. "Sophia? Baby, are you there?" Broadley's voice oozed through the line, warm and sickeningly concerned, the same tone he used when guests were watching. "Thank God. I've been so worried. I know you're confused right now. I know that man has manipulated you, terrified you into going with him." He paused, waiting for her to apologize, to break down, to beg for his forgiveness, as she had done 1,000 times before. "I want you to know that I forgive you," he continued, the benevolence in his voice masking the rot beneath. "I know you're not well. I know this isn't you. Just tell him you want to leave. Come home, Sophia. I'll make you your favorite tea. We can forget this ever happened. I won't even punish Emma for the lies she told." The mention of Emma, and the casual threat wrapped in the promise of mercy, snapped the last tether of fear that held Sophia to him. The trembling in her hands stopped, replaced by a sudden, glacial calm that felt like power. "I'm not confused, Bradley," Sophia said, her voice quiet but steady, cutting through his monologue. "And I'm not unwell. For the first time in 7 years, I am seeing everything perfectly clearly." On the other end of the line, the silence was stunned, as if the furniture in his house had suddenly started speaking back to him. "Sophia, don't be difficult," Broadley warned, the veneer of kindness slipping to reveal the steel edge of control. "You are making a mistake. You have no money, no home, no credibility. If you don't come back right now, I will have you committed. I will lock you away where you will never see the sun, let alone that brat of yours." "You can't lock me away," she interrupted him, her grip on the phone tightening until her knuckles turned white. "Because you don't have a judge anymore. You don't have a police chief. And you don't have a doctor to lie for you." She took a breath, drawing in the scent of Gabriel's penthouse, leather, rain, and safety, and let it fill her lungs. "And I know about the insurance policy, Bradley. I know about the $5 million. The gasp on the other end was audible, a sharp intake of breath that betrayed his shock. "I know you didn't want a wife, you wanted a payday. And I know about Catherine." The name landed like a grenade. The silence that followed was total, devoid of the breathing or the background noise of his confident posturing. Sophia could feel his terror vibrating through the connection, the sudden realization that the mouse he had tortured for sport had walked out of the trap armed with a knife. "I saw the photos," she continued, her voice gaining strength, ringing with the authority of a survivor. "I saw the bruises on her neck that matched the ones on Emma's. I know what you did to her in that bathroom, and I am going to make sure the entire world knows it, too." You bitch," Bradley hissed, his voice unrecognizable, stripped of all pretense, a raw growl of hatred. "You think anyone will believe you? You're nobody. You're a broken little orphan that I pulled out of the gutter. You are dead, Sophia. You hear me? You are dead." "I was already dead in that house," Sophia replied, looking at Gabriel, who was watching her with an expression of fierce pride. "But I woke up. Don't ever call this number again." She pulled the phone away from her ear and placed it gently back on the receiver, severing the connection with a decisive click. The room was quiet, but it was no longer the silence of fear. It was the silence of a battlefield after the decisive shot has been fired. Sophia looked down at her hands, expecting them to be shaking, but they were still. She looked at Gabriel, and for the first time, she didn't see a savior standing above her. She saw a partner standing beside her. "He's scared," she said, a small, incredulous smile touching her lips. "For 7 years, I was the one who was terrified. But now, he's the one who's scared." Gabriel nodded, reaching out to rest his hand on her shoulder, a gesture of solidarity. "He should be," Gabriel said darkly, "because he just realized he's not hunting anymore. He's being hunted." The digital map on Leo's central monitor, which had been tracking Bradley Hartwell's cell phone signal for the last 4 hours, suddenly blinked red and vanished, leaving behind a terrifying void of static. "He's gone dark," Leo announced, his fingers flying across the keyboard in a futile attempt to reacquire the signal, but every ping returned a no-connection error. He pulled the SIM card or destroyed the phone. The last location was an abandoned industrial park near the docks, nowhere near his office or the estate. Gabriel stared at the blank screen, the muscles in his jaw tightening as the hairs on the back of his neck stood up in primal warning. This was the moment he had been waiting for, the pivot point where the civilized lawyer shed his skin and the monster underneath finally took full control. Bradley wasn't running to escape justice. A man who believed he owned the world didn't flee to Mexico with a fake passport. He came for what he believed was his property. The freezing of his assets, the warrant for his arrest, and Sophia's defiance on the phone had stripped him of every weapon he knew how to use, leaving him with only violence. "Lock it down," Gabriel ordered, his voice echoing with the cold authority of a general preparing for a siege. "Marco, double the guards at the elevator and the fire stairs. Dante, I want eyes on the roof access. If a bird lands on this building without my permission, I want to know about it." The penthouse transformed instantly from a sanctuary into a fortress, the steel shutters rolling down over the panoramic windows with a mechanical hiss that blocked out the city lights. Sophia watched the preparations from the kitchen island, her face pale but composed, having finally accepted that the war she had been fighting in silence for 7 years was now loud and visible. She didn't ask if they were safe because she knew the answer. Safety was an illusion until Bradley was in handcuffs or a body bag. The silence of the apartment grew heavy, thick with the anticipation of a storm that was gathering just beyond the steel walls, waiting for the cover of darkness to break. Gabriel found Emma in the hallway, sitting with her back against the wall, clutching the stuffed rabbit that had lost an ear during the escape from the hospital. She looked up at him with wide, intelligent eyes that had seen too much for an 8-year-old, sensing the shift in the atmosphere even if she didn't understand the tactical details. He sat down beside her, ignoring the crease it put in his suit trousers, and treated her not as a child to be distracted, but as a survivor to be respected. "He's coming, isn't he?" Emma whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the air filtration system. Gabriel didn't lie to her. Lying was what Bradley did. "He might try," Gabriel answered honestly, his tone calm and grounding. "But this building is a castle, Emma. And inside this castle, you are not a victim. You are a warrior." He saw the doubt in her eyes, the ingrained belief that she was small and helpless against the towering rage of her stepfather. Gabriel shifted so he was facing her, taking her small hand in his, noting how fragile her fingers looked against his calloused palm. "I want to teach you something," he said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "It's a secret weapon. Do you know what to do if a bad man grabs you and you can't run away?" Emma shook her head, tears welling up as the memory of Bradley's hands on her throat surfaced. "You don't fight him with your hands," Gabriel explained, tapping his own chest. "You use your teeth. If someone puts their hand over your mouth or tries to hold you, you bite them as hard as you can. You don't let go until they scream. Can you do that?" Emma looked at her rabbit, then back at Gabriel, and slowly nodded, a flicker of fierce determination igniting behind the fear. "Good," Gabriel said, squeezing her hand. "You're strong, Emma. Stronger than him." Night fell over the city like a shroud, turning the world outside into a void of wind and rain while the penthouse remained a silent, illuminated island. The waiting was the hardest part, the slow crawl of minutes that stretched into hours while the mind conjured scenarios of invasion. Gabriel stood by the monitors with Leo, watching the grainy feeds from the security cameras stationed around the building's perimeter, searching for any anomaly in the shadows. Sophia joined him, standing close enough that he could feel the heat radiating from her body, her presence a silent reminder of what he was defending. "He knows the building," she said softly, her eyes fixed on a camera feed of the underground parking garage. Before he was a lawyer, his family owned a construction firm. They built half the high-rises in this district in the 90s. He used to brag about knowing the shortcuts that the architects left off the blueprints. The observation hit Gabriel with the force of a physical blow, realigning his understanding of the threat. He had been planning for a frontal assault or a rooftop breach, relying on the modern security systems to hold the line, but Broadley wasn't an outsider trying to break in. He was a ghost returning to a haunt he understood better than the current owners. "Leo, pull the original schematics," Gabriel barked, his calm facade fracturing. "Not the digital ones filed with the city. The builder's blueprints. Check for service tunnels, maintenance shafts, anything that bypasses the electronic locks." As Leo frantically typed, searching for archived PDF files from a defunct construction company, a sudden, jarring thud echoed from deep within the walls of the penthouse. It wasn't the elevator or the doors, it was the sound of a heavy metal grate being kicked open from the inside of a ventilation shaft that wasn't supposed to be large enough for a man to crawl through. Gabriel drew his weapon, the safety clicking off with a deadly snap, realizing that the siege was over and the invasion had already begun. The explosion of noise from the utility room shattered the tense silence of the penthouse as the heavy ventilation grate crashed onto the marble floor, followed instantly by the crack of a gunshot that deafened everyone in the room. Dante, who had moved to intercept the breach, spun violently and hit the ground, clutching a shoulder that was already blooming with dark red blood, while a figure emerged from the cloud of drywall dust like a demon rising from hell. Broadly, Hartwell didn't look like the polished attorney who graced magazine covers anymore. His suit was torn and covered in grime. His eyes were wild with a manic, chemical energy, and the pistol in his hand shook with the vibration of his rage. Gabriel lunged for his own weapon, but he froze when Broadly swung the gun in an erratic arc, pointing it first at Sophia and then, with a sickening lurch of desperation, at Emma. The distance between them was less than 20 feet, yet it felt like a canyon that Gabriel couldn't cross in time, forcing him to hold his fire as the intruder scrambled to his feet and snatched the screaming child from the floor. "Back off," Broadly roared, his voice cracking under the strain of his own hysteria as he dragged Emma against his chest, pressing the cold barrel of the gun into her temple. "You think you can take what's mine? You think you can lock me out of my own life?" He backed toward the panoramic window, using the small, trembling body of a stepdaughter as a human shield, while Sophia let out a sound that was half sob, half scream. She tried to step forward, her hands raised in a pathetic gesture of surrender, begging him to take her instead, but Broadly only laughed, a jagged, broken sound that chilled Gabriel to the bone. "You don't get to bargain, Sophia," Bradley spat, tightening his grip on Emma's hair until her head was yanked back at a painful angle. "You ungrateful bitch. I gave you everything. I gave you a name. I gave you a home. And you repay me by running to a criminal? If I can't have you, then nobody gets to have you. We'll all go together." Gabriel stood motionless, his gun aimed at the floor, his mind racing through 1,000 tactical simulations that all ended in tragedy. He could see the madness in Bradley's eyes, the total detachment from reality that meant negotiation was impossible, Yet a headshot was too risky with Emma thrashing in his grip. "Bradley, look at me," Gabriel said, his voice terrifyingly calm, an anchor in the chaos. "The building is surrounded. There is nowhere to go. Let the girl go, and you walk out of here alive. You hurt her, and I will make sure you feel every second of your death." But Bradley wasn't listening to reason. He was listening to the ghosts of his own collapsing ego. Alive, he sneered, sweat dripping down his face to mix with the grime. "I'm already dead. You took my money. You took my reputation. This isn't about survival anymore, Russo. It's about punishment." His finger tightened on the trigger, the metal whitening against his skin, and Gabriel realized with a jolt of horror that he was going to pull it. But in the suffocating terror of the moment, everyone had forgotten the small, terrified girl trapped in the monster's arms. Emma, whose eyes were squeezed shut against the pain of her pulled hair, suddenly stopped screaming as a memory cut through her panic, a promise she had made in the hallway just hours before. "You are a warrior." She opened her eyes, finding Gabriel's gaze across the room, and saw the slight nod he gave her, a silent permission to unleash her own defense. With a surge of adrenaline that defied her size, Emma opened her mouth and clamped her teeth down onto the fleshy web of Bradley's hand, fighting with all the feral strength of a child fighting for her life. She tasted salt and dirt, but she didn't let go, grinding her jaw until she felt the skin break. Bradley howled in shock and pain, a primal sound of disbelief as he instinctively recoiled from the sudden agony. His grip on the gun loosened for a fraction of a second, his hand jerking away from Emma's head, and that microsecond was all the opening Gabriel needed. He didn't shoot. He launched himself across the room like a missile, crashing into Bradley with enough force to shatter ribs. The gun skittered across the floor, spinning uselessly away as the two men hit the ground in a tangle of limbs and fury. Gabriel was on top of him instantly, his forearm pressing into Bradley's windpipe, cutting off his air and his scream simultaneously. Every instinct in Gabriel's body screamed to finish it, to crush the larynx beneath his arm and end the threat forever. But he saw Sophia rushing to scoop up Emma, and he remembered the endgame. Death was too easy. Death was an escape. "Don't," Gabriel growled through gritted teeth, staring down into Bradley's bulging, terrified eyes. "You don't get the easy way out." He rolled Bradley onto his stomach and wrenched his arms behind his back, securing them with a zip tie. Marco tossed him from the doorway. The fight had drained out of the lawyer as quickly as it had arrived, leaving him gasping and pathetic on the expensive rug. Sirens wailed from the street below, louder this time, signaling that the real cavalry, Amanda Cole and the FBI, were finally breaching the lobby. Gabriel stood up, straightening his suit jacket, and looked at Sophia, who was rocking Emma on the floor, both of them crying but alive. He walked over to them, ignoring the man groaning at his feet, and placed a hand on Emma's head. "You did it," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "You saved us, little warrior." The trial of Bradley Hartwell was not merely a legal proceeding, it was the public autopsy of a monster who had hidden in plain sight for a decade. The heavy oak doors of the federal courthouse were besieged by a sea of reporters, cameras flashing like lightning in a storm, but inside courtroom 4B, the air was still and thick with the weight of impending judgment. Gabriel sat in the front row of the gallery, his presence a dark, silent anchor amidst the buzzing energy of the spectators. He wore a charcoal suit that mirrored the solemnity of a funeral, his eyes fixed on the man slumped at the defense table. Bradley was no longer the master of the universe in a $3,000 suit, clad in an orange jumpsuit that hung loosely on his frame. With unwashed hair and shackles chafing his wrists, he looked small, a pathetic shrinkage of the giant who had once terrorized his household with impunity. He refused to look at the gallery, keeping his gaze glued to the table, his hands trembling with a mixture of withdrawal and terror as the prosecution laid out the architecture of his cruelty. When Sophia took the stand, the room fell so silent that the hum of the air conditioning sounded like a roar. She walked to the witness box not with the skittish, hunted gait of the woman Gabriel had carried out of the hospital, but with the steady, measured steps of a survivor who had walked through fire and refused to burn. She placed her hand on the Bible, swore to tell the truth, and then turned to face the jury, 12 ordinary people who looked back at her with a mixture of pity and anticipation. For 3 hours, Sophia spoke. She didn't cry. She didn't stumble. She detailed the 7 years of systematic torture with a clinical precision that was far more devastating than tears. She described the nights locked in the basement, the forced isolation from her friends, the way he would smile at dinner parties while gripping her thigh hard enough to leave bruises that wouldn't fade for weeks. She told them about the accidents, the 23 trips to the emergency room, and how each one was a rehearsal for her murder. "He didn't just want to hurt me," Sophia said, her voice clear and carrying to the back of the room where Gabriel watched with fierce pride. "He was erasing me. He was building a narrative of a clumsy, mentally unstable woman so that when he finally killed me for the insurance money, just like he killed Catherine, no one would ask a single question." The mention of Catherine Hartwell sent a ripple of shock through the courtroom, a collective gasp that sucked the oxygen out of the space. The prosecution then introduced Exhibit C, the Catherine files provided by Detective Amanda Cole. Photos of the first wife's battered body were projected onto the screens, side by side with photos of Sophia's injuries and the finger-shaped bruises on Emma's neck. The visual evidence was undeniable, a gruesome diptych of violence that painted Broadley not as a tragic widower, but as a serial predator who viewed women as disposable ATMs. The defense attorney, a court-appointed lawyer who clearly wanted to be anywhere else, tried to object, but the momentum of the truth was an avalanche that buried his weak protests. The final nail in the coffin came from Dr. Michael Stevens, who testified in exchange for a reduced sentence. Sweating and refusing to meet Bradley's eyes, the disgraced doctor admitted to falsifying records for years, confirming that Bradley had paid him specifically to hide the signs of abuse. "He told me she was clumsy," Stevens mumbled into the microphone. "But I knew. We all knew. I just didn't want to lose my membership of the club." The jury didn't even need to deliberate for the rest of the day. They returned in less than 2 hours, their faces grim and set with the weight of their decision. "We find the defendant, Bradley Hartwell, guilty on all counts," the jury foreman read, his voice shaking slightly. "First-degree murder of Catherine Hartwell. Attempted murder of Sophia Hartwell. Aggravated assault of a minor. Insurance fraud. Conspiracy to obstruct justice." Bradley let out a strangled sound, half sob and half scream, as the verdict washed over him. He looked around the courtroom wildly, searching for an ally, for a judge he had bribed or a cop he owned, but the seats were filled with strangers who looked at him with revulsion. The corruption that had shielded him was gone, dismantled by the man sitting quietly in the front row. The judge, a stern woman with eyes like flint who had replaced the disgraced Morrison, looked down at Bradley over her spectacles. "Mr. Hartwell, your crimes are among the most heinous I have ever witnessed in this court. You use the law as a weapon to torture those you are sworn to protect. It is the judgment of this court that you be sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole." The gavel came down with a finality that echoed like a gunshot. 2 federal marshals moved in, hauling Bradley to his feet as he began to scream, begging, pleading, claiming it was all a mistake, all a conspiracy. Sophia, tell them," he shrieked, twisting in the marshal's grip to look at his ex-wife. "I love you. I did it for us." Sophia didn't flinch. She simply looked at him, her expression calm and detached, as if she were watching a stranger being removed from a restaurant for causing a scene. She held his gaze until the doors swung shut behind him, silencing his screams and sealing him in the darkness he had tried to trap her in. The courtroom erupted into noise, reporters shouting questions, but Sophia heard none of it. She looked at Gabriel, who stood up and offered his arm. She took it, feeling the solid, warm strength of him, and together they walked down the center aisle, pushing through the crowd not as victims, but as victors walking out of the grave and into the sun. 2 years had passed since the gavel fell, silencing the ghosts that had haunted the Hartwell estate for a decade. The penthouse garden, once a solitary refuge for a man who believed he deserved to be alone, was now filled with the soft murmur of a string quartet and the scent of white roses. There were no flashing cameras or society reporters trying to capture the union of the city's most feared crime lord and the woman who had brought him to his knees. It was a private affair, witnessed only by the people who had blood to make this moment possible. Marco and Leo stood as groomsmen, their suits tailored to hide the holsters that were no longer needed but never left behind, while Amanda Cole sat in the front row, wiping away tears that she would fiercely deny later. But the sight that stole the breath from Gabriel's lungs wasn't the skyline or the flowers, it was Sophia walking toward him. She moved with a grace that was no longer tentative, her head held high, wearing a dress that didn't hide her scars, but embraced them as mats of the journey that had led her back to him. Gabriel, he said, his voice rough with an emotion he had once considered a weakness. Take you, Sophia, not to own, but to cherish. Not to control, but to protect. I promise to be the wall between you and the world, and the safe harbor where you can rest. Sophia squeezed his hands, her eyes shining with the light that had been extinguished for 7 years, and was now burning brighter than the sun. Sophia, she whispered, her voice steady and sure. Take you, Gabriel, to be my partner in the dark and in the light. I promise to never run from the shadows again, because I know you are the one standing in them, waiting for me. When they kissed, it wasn't just a seal on a marriage certificate. It was the final destruction of the cage Bradley Hartwell had built. It was a declaration that love, when fought for with blood and courage, was the only law that truly mattered. The building on 4th Street didn't look like a fortress from the outside, but inside, it was safer than the Federal Reserve. A bronze plaque by the heavy oak doors read simply, "The Catherine House." It wasn't just a shelter, it was a sanctuary funded by the Russo Empire, a place where women and children fleeing violence could find not just a bed, but a new life. Sophia stood in the lobby, watching a young mother carrying a sleeping toddler sign the intake forms. "We named it for her," Sophia explained to the donor standing beside her, touching the framed photo of Catherine Hartwell that hung in the place of honor. "Because she didn't have anyone to hear her scream. We are going to make sure that never happens to anyone else in the city." Gabriel stood in the background, watching his wife command the room with a quiet authority that awed him. He had used his money to buy judges and silence enemies for years, but seeing it used to build the shield for the innocent gave him a sense of purpose that power alone had never provided. He wasn't just the boss of the underworld anymore. He was the guardian of the people the world wanted to forget. The sun began to set, casting long, golden shadows across the penthouse living room, turning the space into a warm, glowing haven. Emma, now 10 years old and taller, sat on the rug, reading a book aloud to the baby sleeping in the bassinet. She didn't flinch at loud noises anymore. She didn't hide food in her pockets. She was just a girl who loved her little brother, a boy named Michael, after the archangel who defeated the dragon. Gabriel sat in his armchair, watching them, a feeling of profound peace settling over him. He realized that for all the wars he had fought, for all the enemies he had crushed, this was the only victory that counted. He had stormed a hospital, dismantled a corrupt legal system, and burned down his own roles to get here. He looked at Sophia, who was curled up on the sofa watching him, and he knew that he would do it all again, 1,000 times over. This story reminds us that the darkest prisons aren't always made of iron bars. Sometimes they are made of gold rings and silence. Sophia's journey teaches us that no matter how broken you feel, your spirit is unbreakable if you can just find one person to believe in you. It shows us that true strength isn't about how hard you can hit, but about how fiercely you can protect the ones you love. And most importantly, it proves that family isn't defined by blood or last names, but by the people who show up when you are at your lowest and refuse to leave until you are safe. Thank you for listening to this story on Sunni romance. We hope it touched your heart and reminded you that it is never too late to rewrite your own ending. We want to know what you think. Do you believe that everyone deserves a second chance, even a man like Gabriel? Or do you think some pasts are too dark to redeem? Let us know in the comments below because we read every single one. If this story moved you, please like the video and share it with someone who might need a reminder that they are not alone. Until next time, stay safe, keep fighting, and remember that even in the storm, there is always a way home.